Howdy YouTubers, this is Steven, and I want to talk with you guys for a minute about an article that I read, and particularly about a particular part of an article that I read. Alright, so the name of the article is New Mexican Spanish, semicolon, Demise of the Earliest European Variety in the United States, by Dr. Garland D. And you may have heard of his name here or there if you're interested or have studied New Mexican Spanish, as well as his colleague's name, Nettie Vigil. But this particular article is authored by specifically only Garland D. Dr. Garland D. But in the article, he presents what he calls myths about the Spanish language in New Mexico, or New Mexican Spanish. And I just want to go through those myths and give my opinions and takes on things, and basically just help start a dialogue about New Mexican Spanish. All right, so here we go. The first myth, as Dr. Bills calls it, is that English is good and Spanish is not so good. And he goes on to explain, in the Southwest, as well as in the United States more generally, the Spanish language is widely considered to occupy a social position vis-a-vis English that is decidedly inferior, if not downright depraved. So they're basically Dr. Bills is just explaining the position that Spanish occupies in the United States in relation to English. Like, English is seen as the language of prestige, the prestigious language. It's the language that you're going to use when, you're going to go to court, or you're going to get, obtain more education, or, the language that politicians use generally. It's the language you need in order to be successful in the United States. You need to have English. Whereas in other countries, like say Spain, you would need Spanish to be successful, because that's the language that you need in order to, fully function and operate within the society. Let's see. The next part of that is the socioeconomic support for this myth perceptibly on a daily basis in the material trappings and social status of users of the two languages is powerful and convincing to the young and impressionable. Thus, we find such ambivalent attitudes. But before I go into the ambivalent attitudes, I just want to speak on what I just read. All right, so basically, Dr. Bills here is saying that basically the youth, especially, as well as Spanish speakers in general, kind of like they know, like, the people who speak Spanish only typically are not as successful as the people who speak both Spanish and English or just English. And the youth, they understand that, like, they take note of that, and it is encouraged, generally it's encouraged to learn English when not just, all immigrant groups. And really, these people right here aren't really immigrants, to be honest. They're kind of lumped into this situation of immigrants because of the language situation. But, many times they just come from a Spanish-speaking background that's probably been here, been a part of, their state and their region for centuries. But they're not foreigners. I just want to put that out there. They're not necessarily foreigners. There could be some in some cases, but there's some people in New Mexico who have like a long family history in the United States. They're not like people who are from other countries. All right. Next, Dr. Bills presents a quote from someone with a point of view that sort of supports this. All right. He says, this person says, I'm bilingual, and my life would not be any different if I did not speak Spanish. And for me right there, I'm like, really? Your life wouldn't be any different if you didn't speak Spanish? Like, Like, I speak Spanish, and it's not part of my heritage. I guess you could say it is because I'm, from the United States, but I'm not from, the Spanish speaking part. But it's not a part of my heritage. But I think my life would be different if I didn't speak Spanish, or, didn't have the part of my life. But that's what he thinks. Next, I'm glad, however, to be able to speak 2 languages. That's good. That's good that he's positive about that. All right, next. My daughters do not speak Spanish, and I have no guilty feelings about it. Okay, all right. So he didn't want to pass on the language to his daughters, and he probably had a reason for that. That does happen. That can create issues in the situation too about identity, because it's like, you're called Hispanic or Latino, and people expect you to speak Spanish, and you can't really connect with some people, or you may feel sort of a disconnect because you can't speak Spanish. But another video for another day. All right. Next, he says, my wife and I wanted them to speak good English. All right. Okay. Since this is the official language of our country. Technically, it's not the official language of our country, but nevertheless, it is the de facto language of our country. So, yeah. But I get what he's saying there. He's saying, like, that's the language that we use in the country, English, more so than Spanish. And I can understand why he would want to do that. He wants his daughters to have the best in life, the best opportunities. He doesn't want them to feel like they've been, held back because they don't know how to speak English very well. I guess he felt that having them speak both Spanish and English may have been a bit too much or a bit too confusing. Because sometimes that does happen when the child just can't take on both languages, and just have to choose between one language or the other because they wind up like mixing up the language and getting confused by it or something like that. I know I had a Spanish teacher who had a situation like that with her child, so they just went on and taught the child English because they were in the United States. So I don't fault him for wanting his daughters to speak English. However, I do fault him for thinking that his life would not be any different if he did not speak Spanish. He should be proud of that. Well, I don't think he's not proud of it, but I think he should realize that that is a significant part of you. All right. So here's the second myth that people have in relation to New Mexican Spanish, as Dr. Bills puts it. All right. The second myth is standard Spanish is good and our Spanish is bad. New Mexican Spanish. Because I think the person who wrote the article is also a part of the culture, which is good. It's a good thing. So he goes on to explain that although the Manitos, and that's just what they call a name of a particular ethnic group, tend to have a negative attitude toward the Spanish language in general, they have ambivalent feelings about their own variety. So basically it's saying that, people who speak Spanish in New Mexico or speak New Mexican Spanish already have somewhat of a negative idea of Spanish, because I guess basically like Hispanophobia has came in and, made it seem like it's something bad, as well as other factors as well, economic status and things like that. So already about Spanish in general have a bad attitude towards it, but also of their own Spanish, they have a really bad attitude towards it because their Spanish is not seen as standard or, quote unquote, correct Spanish. Right. Dr. Bills explains, on one level, Spanish may be warm and the warm and comforting language of the home. Yet, on a more superficial and more sensitive level, the Spanish speakers of New Mexico are often told, whether by outsiders or by more proficient vernacular speakers within the community, that their Spanish is deficient. So they're kind of getting it from both sides. They're getting it from the English speakers who's telling them that Spanish is bad, then they're getting it from Spanish speakers that their particular Spanish is bad. So the New Mexican Spanish speakers are getting it from, both ends of the spectrum, even from people within the community to an extent. So that can be tough. So that, I have heard that, some people who speak New Mexican Spanish probably won't speak it with people who are not of the community. If you're not a part of that community, not a part of the family or their family, they're not going to speak it with you. They'll just speak English with you. And I can see why, because they're, getting criticized for their Spanish. And I guess the criticism can kind of just, it gets to them. They don't want to have to deal with the criticism because it's too much to deal with. All right, let's see. Dr. Bills goes on to say that such observations typically come from outsiders with a strong Spanish prescriptivism tradition, who see New Mexican Spanish as corrupt and degenerate. Equally sad is the fact that proficient speakers in the local community often laugh at those Hispanos who, for whatever reason, have failed to develop decent communicative competency in Spanish, thus contributing further to their avoidance of the language. So again, like, they're getting it from a lot of different places here. They're getting it from the people in their community who speak Spanish very well. Then they're getting it from the Spanish speakers from outside the community, from like Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries, that their Spanish is bad. Then they're getting some, mess from the English speakers who are just saying that Spanish is bad in general. So they're just getting it from all ends of the spectrum. And because of that, I think that's part of the reason why New Mexican Spanish may sort of be on the decline, so to speak. But, linguistically speaking, standard Spanish is probably seen as good because it's like prestigious, so to speak. Like, it can help you obtain success. But ultimately, no Spanish is better than the next Spanish, just like no English is better than the next English, no French is better than the next French, etc. It's just a different way of speaking it. What makes the New Mexican vernacular of Spanish less prestigious or, less desirable than the Mexican form of Spanish? I mean, is it because it has an English influence or a native influence? Well, Mexican Spanish has a native influence, but people don't, bash it. Spanish in Spain has a Catalan influence, or possibly other languages as well, influences from them at times. So I'm guessing ultimately it's just because of the position that the Spanish speakers of New Mexican Spanish occupy. They occupy a position in society that is probably more so a working class position. If they were like politicians, doctors, lawyers, people who occupy more of a higher status in society, then their Spanish might be seen a little differently. So unfortunately, it's just discrimination based on class, perhaps. And possibly as well, racism may have something to do with it. All right. Let's see. I'll end up in this part of the second part of the myth. Dr. Bills explains, perhaps in compensation for the inferiority complex about their Spanish, a third myth bestows some historical esteem on the speech of the Manitos. So the third myth that Dr. Bills talks about is that the New Mexican dialect of Spanish is the Spanish of 16th century Spain, the Spanish of Cervantes. And this one is a myth. And people, he also brings up another myth that people have about English. He says, like, like the supposed pure Elizabethan nature of the rustic English of Highland Kentucky or Tennessee. This romantic and totally erroneous myth is widely believed and endlessly parroted. But to be fair, I can see why people believe this myth because based on some of the ways that, like some of the words that come up in New Mexican Spanish that I've seen, yeah, it kind of does seem to mirror, sort of like a medieval type of Spanish. Even some of the words that they use is sort of kind of has like a medieval influence with it. I think, like they use the word, I think, agora to mean ahora, now, as well the word ca to mean porque, to mean because. Um, so yeah, I have seen some things where okay, I can see like they didn't really update the Spanish to reflect the contemporary Spanish that's spoken now. So I can see why people would kind of think that. But Dr. Bills, he ain't going for it. And I guess it's because the indigenous influence and the English influence, as well as the Spanish of Mexico influence that New Mexican Spanish has undergone, and it's taken from those different languages and dialects. So it's like, okay, you can't really claim to be 16th century anymore. So I guess maybe that's why. He doesn't really explain it in this article. All right, the fourth and last myth is a good one. And here we go. Dr. Bill says, no need to worry. The fourth myth is no need to worry since New Mexico is an officially bilingual state, so Spanish is protected. People think that, but that's not true. New Mexico is not an officially bilingual state. However, Spanish was mentioned in the state constitution of New Mexico in 2 articles, and Dr. Bills explains. So here he goes. One article specified that all laws be published in Spanish for 20 years, and this was around 1912. New Mexico became a state in 1911. In 1912, the state constitution was made, and they put in it that one of the things they put in about Spanish is that all laws need to be published in Spanish for 20 years. This regulation was later extended for an additional 10 years, but the publication requirement has not been enforced in over 50 years. However, I think, like, generally speaking, at least with the government, they do offer, information in Spanish and probably some services as well, depending on if you live in a heavily Spanish-speaking area. So, yeah, perhaps. But, ultimately, they are not legally obligated to offer it, though. That's the thing. All right. The next article talks about, is in regards to teachers. Let's see. The article mandated that teachers be trained in Spanish, but the intent of this mandate has been consistently interpreted as referring not to all teachers, but just to teachers of presumably monolingual Spanish-speaking children. The truth is that the Spanish language enjoys no official status and no special protection in the state of New Mexico. It should, but it doesn't. And to be fair, I think people still kind of do this. They don't do it. Well, let me specify what I'm saying. In regards to the teachers being bilingual, They do that, at least in the younger years, I think. If an area is known to have a large Spanish-speaking population, I think they'll have like bilingual um, teachers for the students, I think, though. I think the educational system will provide that. I think so. Even though they're not legally obligated to do it, I guess. But I guess they probably are, because this article is not. This article doesn't expire. The other one expired. It expired in 20 years or 30 years, however you want to see it. But this article doesn't have an expiration date. So, yeah, I think they're good with this one. But I guess people are just encouraged to learn English and to use English. Which is true, because we do live in the United States, and that's the language you need. But, you know, to sum it up, New Mexico is not an officially bilingual state as far as the law is concerned. You know, Spanish doesn't hold any special status in New Mexico. It doesn't have any special protection in Mexico. It should. I think whoever did the Constitution should have put in the Constitution that Spanish be an official language of New Mexico. Kind of like how they did, sort of like with Quebec, or in Quebec when it came to French. They made sure that French was protected in writing and by law. You know, put it all in writing and all by law. Even though, you know, to be fair, Quebec French is having issues with maintaining, you know, its language and things like that, though. But they did put it in the law, so they can always go back to the law. But here, yeah, in New Mexico, no, they didn't really put it into law as strongly as they should have. And that probably has something to do with just the position that the Spanish speakers had at the time. You know, as well, there was a large influx of English speakers too, and that sort of affected things. As well as, again, Hispanophobia. You know, Hispanophobia, a fear of things pertaining to, I guess, Spanish culture or Spanish people, things like that. But I think it's, you know, I think that it could be done now. I think that they'll probably have to do it where Spanish is a co-official language with English, not just Spanish itself, though, because I think that will cause a lot of animosity. You know, because unfortunately, people still kind of view Spanish, as well as people who speak Spanish, as foreign, even though Spanish has been spoken in this particular area of the United States for centuries. You know, even before English was spoken. You know, this region was settled before Jamestown was even thought of. You know, before Jamestown came into existence, and you know, Plymouth Rock and all that stuff. But you know, that's just, like I said before, an inconvenient truth that people kind of gloss over and don't want to recognize and things like that. But Dr. Beals goes on to conclude that, quote unquote, these myths and many others, together with the social inequalities that seem to go hand in hand with Spanish, conspire to devalue Spanish as a communicative tool, except for intimate situations associated with family and friends, and sometimes the immediate neighborhood or small village. Yeah, I think so. It's like, you know, again, being very discouraged from using the language. Let's see. He also continues on. Let's see. Quote unquote. With each successive generation, proficiency in Spanish and the context for its use dwindles towards extinction. A central piece of 4 centuries of ethnic heritage, the ethnic language is thus lost to increasing numbers of the ethnic group. So I guess if someone doesn't take any sort of like action to safeguard the language, then it could be lost. The New Mexican variety of it can be lost. Thankfully, at least the Spanish language itself won't be lost for a while, because, you know, there is like a media the Spanish-speaking media, as well as an influx of immigrants from Mexico, as well as probably other places too, which helps generate Spanish, you know. But again, like, I don't think New Mexico is producing Spanish speakers. Like, I think that, say, Quebec is producing French speakers, and Puerto Rico is producing Spanish speakers. You know, despite both of those places being, I let's say, I know Puerto Rico is officially bilingual by state law. You know, they have English and Spanish as the official languages, but I'm not sure about Quebec. I think they might have just gone with French being the only language. I think so, which causes issues with them too. It's like in Canada, because they're like, hey, don't you guys want to be a part of the rest of Canada with us? And they're like, But I just thought those, myths, as he puts it, were interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Feel free to let me know your opinions. Feel free to let me know what you guys think. Feel free to comment. Feel free to subscribe to me. Feel free to give me a thumbs up. Your feedback and your support is extremely appreciated. Until the next video, adios and goodbye for now.